a very painful blow for most South Africans, especially for those who were part of the liberation movement, who had been oppressed during apartheid, etc. I think Chris Hani really represented the best values in South African society and really embodied a lot of the visions, the hopes and aspirations of many people, especially the poor, the most vulnerable, the most exploited. And of course, this is coming against a painful, inevitable but painful still event when the Constitutional Court ruled that Janus Valus needed to be released on parole, that he had completed his life sentence in prison and so forth. And yes, whilst that is inevitable under the parole law of South Africa, in fact, most countries, that when you go into prison, you serve your sentence and eventually you will come out. But I think it's still nonetheless a painful reliving of old wounds which are not fully healed. So really it's quite unfortunate somebody's then chose to go and vandalize the memorial where you're still grappling with a very painful episode. And really just speak to people who have no sense of compassion or respect to other people in society. And we need to, it's unfortunate to say the least. And we hope the police will investigate and we hope we will find the perpetrators. That might be very difficult.
And I repeat what I said, what sick mind would resort to something like that? It was totally and absolutely mindless. But be as it may, this provocative attack comes in the same week that Janus Valus was granted parole, and that within 10 days. Obviously, the late Chris Hani's wife, Limpo, was highly upset about his parole. And people have been debating that issue. People have been saying things like forgive and move on. But only she knows her pain, and only she knows what a difference perhaps Chris Hani could have made to this country. We also know that the assassination of Chris Hani took South Africa possibly on the brink of a civil war, civil unrest. So, we thank God that that didn't in fact happen. We're also hearing, there was a report in the press that Janus Valus was attacked in prison. He was stabbed in prison. I'm kind of wondering, in all the years that he served time, there was never any reports about him being attacked at all or being hurt. And all of a sudden, now that he's being released on parole, on the back of the fact that the Chris Hani's memorial was desecrated, we now hear that he was stabbed in prison. I'm wondering if it is related in any way. Do you think someone was out to get him? Where to now on this entire issue?
I mean, look, so only the investigating officers could know what is behind the attack, etc. But it wouldn't be surprising. I mean, Chris Hani is a beloved figure in South Africa's history. Janus Valus, he did a terrible blow to society. And of course, I think emotions are running very high. The vandalism of the tombstone doesn't help matters. We have no sympathy for Janus Valus. He came to South Africa and he did a terrible thing, which really was not just the murder of an individual person and the devastation of their family, but it was a devastating blow to the entire nation. But look, there was nothing the Constitutional Court could do, in all honesty. The parole law does indicate that eventually, once you completed your sentence that the judge has given to you, you would be released on parole. You could only be further detained if you'd been convicted for an additional offense and you then had an additional sentence added on. Parole also does mean that eventually it's a transition from when you're in prison to when you're released back into society. It might include house arrest, might include which hours you must be at home, which hours can you be at work, etc. Eventually, you would be allowed to exit parole as well. Perhaps the question we should be having with ourselves is that are our sentencing laws sufficient for the gravity of some of the offenses people are convicted for? Because time and again, we see people being convicted for very serious offenses of murder, of rape, child abuse, other horrific crimes, and they serve quite minimal sentences of a few years, and then they're back into society. In the meantime, those people's families are still carrying the wounds of the past. They've not been able to heal, and yet they see the perpetrator after 5, 7 years, 10 years going out and enjoying life at their expense, So I think that we should be asking, is life sentencing, which normally means 20 years in prison in South Africa and across the world, is that sufficient for certain crimes? Should we not be extending it beyond 20 years to 40 years or whatever might be relevant? Similar with other crimes as well.
When the news broke on Janus Valus's parole, there were there were sentiments in the media suggesting that South Africa should reintroduce the death penalty. Of course, the response to that was that our constitution doesn't allow it. But it does make one wonder, doesn't it? Because there's so many people. I mean, South Africa is such a violent country for whatever reason. It could be the past, our very, the apartheid laws that were brought up in, the hardship that Black people suffered under apartheid, and a whole host more. Uh, but it almost seems as if crime does pay and life is very cheap. And do you believe that perhaps the Constitutional Court should be re-looking the death penalty? Because maybe that could act as a deterrent for very violent and serious crimes.
Yeah, so look, I mean, the Constitution has a Bill of Rights. The certain rights cannot be compromised, and that includes the issue of life. I don't think South Africa will go back to the issue of the death penalty. The difficulty with the death penalty, as much as one might want at an individual on a personal level for certain criminals and people who have murdered, raped children, etc., the difficulty there is that we see many other countries in the world that often we convict people wrongly because of circumstantial evidence or because of limitations of technology. Years later, forensic technology might have improved. We then later find out that the person we had convicted for this crime actually was innocent. We've seen time and again in the United States, with all of its resources and its development, many times you find that people have been convicted, even sentenced for crimes, or they spent 25 years, 30 years in prison, only for later for forensic evidence to actually show these people were innocent, that it was somebody else who murdered this person, etc. So that's a difficulty, because once you execute somebody, you cannot release that person. That life is gone. At least if somebody's been sentenced to prison and he's later cleared, you can release them. You can try to compensate them, albeit not enough. But yeah, and of course, at times you would also see that in the US and many other countries, including South Africa, your ability to get yourself out of court, out of conviction, often is linked to your wealth. If you're rich, you can afford a very powerful lawyer who knows the systems, can defend you very well. If you're poor, you may not afford a lawyer. You may get an overstretched, poorly trained public attorney, and that person may not have the time to spend protesting your innocence. I think for us, that's the more difficult thing. The more effective way to resolving crime is to capacitate the police, the courts, the National Prosecuting Authority, to make sure that we investigate, we apprehend the people who are guilty of crimes, we make sure they go brought to trial, they're convicted. I think that's for us the biggest thing, because death sentence is merely a sentence, just like life sentencing. The more critical thing is to investigate and to arrest and to try and to convict and sentence people. That's the most effective deterrent.
Yeah, I always wonder, I always think about judges. I kind of think about them and think that they really do play God with our lives, don't they? Right? They choose. Would you agree with that?
Look, the judges, to be fair to them, they judge based upon the laws that parliamentarians draft. So perhaps the question we should be asking to the parliamentarians is that if we're not happy, and I think most of us are not happy with the sentencing laws we have, with the parole laws we have, surely it's time we review them. Because at times and again, we've seen how softly they treat criminals. We've seen criminals with powerful connections abuse medical parole, get released after minimum sentences. So I think for us, that's the more useful thing, because the judge is just going to interpret what's put in front of them in black and white in the law. So if the law says you can go to prison after 2 years, they will do that. If the law says you can go to prison after 40 years, the judges will do that. So I think for us, that's the more useful way to resolving it, in addition to capacitating the police, the judiciary, the NPA as well.
Okay, we have a comment from a listener. Let's get the comment up on screen. Let me read it to you and then we'll wrap up the issue. Can we have the comment up on screen, please? Because I'm only getting part of the comment here. Let me see if I can fix that. The top part of the comment has been chopped off on my screen, so I am not winning. Okay. I think it says, I'm going to do a bit of guesswork here because I can't get the thing. All right. Why vandalism on the more? All right. We need to get I'm not getting the full message on the screen. Matthews, I will wrap up with you. I'll read those messages after I have concluded the interview with you, because I think part of it has been cut off. Okay, let's take the second message, which says from Niven. He says, this seems to be a growing problem. Maria Shriver's grave was dug up, and so was Lord William Napier's son's grave, plus a monument in memory of the transport riders to Pilgrim's Rest and Graskop. It's really shocking. Okay, that's the one comment, but the earlier comment has been chopped off halfway. I can't get my controller to, it's not on screen. Okay, I'll get to that message a little later once we get our thing sorted out here. It's still cut off, unfortunately. Matthews, let me give you the final words on the interview this morning. How would you like to wrap up?
So look, I think for me, the most critical things, one is to, besides expressing our anger and our frustration, I think we do need to have a discussion as a country about our parole and our sentencing laws. They're clearly not strict enough, not just for the issue of Chris Hani, but for many other victims of brutal crimes. We need to do better by the victims, by the families. We shouldn't be having criminals getting out of prison so quickly. We also need to say, as a country, have we really lived up to the ideas, to the sacrifices, to the vision, the aspirations that Chris Hani represented? I think in many areas we did well since 1994, around the provision of free housing, social grants, free water, electricity, free education, etc. But in many others areas we have done badly, many areas we've actually regressed, many areas we're falling behind. So surely we should be using this moment of Chris Hani's memory to say, what can we do more to address our many challenges? The issue of unemployment, of poverty, of inequality, the levels of crime and gender-based violence, the levels of corruption in the state. I think all of these issues we should be saying, if we truly want to honor the memory of Chris Hani, then on these issues, whether we're trade unions, whether we're civil society or churches or mosques, whether we're in government or business or wherever, we should all be doing much better to honor his memory, because his memory essentially was of making life better for all South Africans, especially the most poor, the most vulnerable citizens.
Matthew Parks, Parliamentary Coordinator for COSATU, talking to us about the vandalisation or the desecration of the Chris Hani Memorial, and obviously they condemn that, and they do want the authorities to investigate this thoroughly and swiftly so that the perpetrators can be brought to book. Thank you indeed for your time. Always nice talking with you. It is exactly 9:47 a.m.